So today we'll be mostly talking about application onboarding, right? How do we do it in terms of every aspect? When I say every aspect, I mean we'll have a separate discussion on the technical front, and then on how to give effort estimates, how to expedite the process, right? So that is exactly what we're going to talk about now. I'll try if I could cover some other topics as well. So I think we had a discussion about Oracle DBS at the target yesterday. So I'll see if we can cover that as well. Right. So I'll get going. Firstly, let's have a small discussion. This is all it is about, right? Application onboarding basically means integrating your IDM application with the target application. Now, this doesn't only cover provisioning and reconciliation, but also obviously the advanced configurations that we have. Let's say in Saviynt, we have SODs, you have analytics attestation campaigns, right? All these operations you can only perform on a target application once it is connected, right? Once you are able to make the information flow between your IDM application and the target application. That is what is fairly important to understand that what application onboarding is. So I think we've been discussing it through and throughout. Now, what happens is every application is not the same. Okay, so once you start talking about different kind of applications, and I've been giving you these examples of, let's say, a Salesforce application. I've given example of Yammer as well. I've told you a lot about custom applications, which is a very important thing to understand. And then we have something which is fairly common, let's say, as Microsoft Exchange. And just to keep the diversity in, I'll also mention a legacy application. Okay. So whenever any of these application, any type of these application needs to be connected to my IDM system, I'll say that I'll be doing application onboarding. But before I can do application onboarding, there is certain kind of analysis that I need to do. Okay. And that kind of analysis is extremely critical because once you start creating artifacts, so see, by now you've started to understand that if you want to create a connection to any of these applications, you need to use connectors, you'll create connection security system endpoints, right? And then you'll use advanced configuration like an analytics attestation and SODs. But the point is, you can only develop something in a meaningful manner once you understand the true nature of this integration, right? And so is the case with giving estimations that whenever you give a client that, okay, this is in how much time we will be able to onboard an application, there has to be a logic behind it because this entire process needs to be justifiable from an effort perspective as well, right? And only then you can tell that, okay, this is the time and this is the, let's say, cost that it will incur for you to onboard an application. So what you need to do is you need to bifurcate these applications based on their own behavior. Okay. What do I mean by that is, let's say if you have an out-of-the-box application, such as Salesforce, for which you have out-of-the-box connector, it is it is not only let's say you cannot just say that, okay, I will onboard Salesforce within 5 days because I have an out-of-the-box connector, right? So this argument stands to for a very generic kind of implementation. But mostly when you start integrating or onboarding application, you'll get to know that the requirements of the client are fairly complex, right? So even though you have an out-of-the-box connector, the amount of time that it might take for you to onboard an application actually is substantially more. Okay, and that is why you need to create a proper standardized path on what are the considerations that you'll keep to make sure that you are able to onboard the application in time and how much time it is going to take. Now, what are those considerations is something that we have to understand. Okay, so whenever you are onboarding an application, there could be two type of considerations. There could be two type of criteria based on which you will decide how much time will it take for you to onboard an application. One is at the Saviynt level, okay, that how many let's say artifacts do you need to create, how much complications do you see at the Saviynt level for to configure this app, and the second is at the target level. Okay, but by target level, I mean that the application in itself, how complex the application is, how let's say how many artifacts at the target level is there, and how complex are they. So let's say within Salesforce instance, there could be a very simple Salesforce instance as well, where you have only three objects: user, groups, and licenses. and all these three functions exactly the same way a usual Salesforce, let's say, setup is done. But then there is a possibility for some other application, or let's say even for Salesforce, which has been set up in a very complex manner, and there are not only three, but let's say five or seven all type of objects that is being managed within this Salesforce instance that the client would like you to manage from Saviynt going forward, right? And then let's say the amount of workflows that are involved, the amount of reporting that they need for Salesforce, if that is, let's say, exponentially more as compared to what a usual Salesforce instance will take, obviously the complication of this integration will also suffer. Also, you need to understand how many Saviynt environments do you have, because usually when you do this development work of integration, you will be firstly integrating Saviynt dev environment with the target applications dev environment. And once you feel that everything looks fine and all the features are met, all the requirements are met, then you'll move this Saviynt and target application integration to a test environment where it will be tested by, let's say, either someone from the client side or a combination of both, someone from the client side and then from your own team as well, right? And subsequently, when that sort of testing is also done, then you move it into production, right? So it is not just like configuring an application from and integrating it between Saviynt and let's say the packet application itself. It is also about making sure that things are working in a standardized manner. So that is a key consideration while you give an estimate or start thinking about onboarding an application. Now, another thing to understand is what kind of technology is the target using. Okay, so that is more on a technical front. So let's move on to there. Okay, so this is how a normal process of application onboarding looks like. Okay, these are the key four steps that you should keep in mind while you are trying to do analysis. Okay, so what are these analysis? I'll tell you here. So basically, the first is application IAM capabilities analysis. So I think this is nothing new, and I think you guys might also understand it by yourself. Just again, that whenever you are trying to onboard an application, you firstly need to understand what are the IAM capabilities of the application itself. Okay, so what are the IAM capabilities that the application exposes? Okay, either exposes or let's say uses. What we also want to understand is what can I do? So let's say as a user or as an administrator, once I log into Salesforce, right? What can I do within Salesforce? That is also something that I would like to understand. And why is that? Because see, from our perspective, though we want to integrate it with Saviynt and going forward manage it from Saviynt's end, we need to understand that usually when the Salesforce admin logs into the Salesforce console, what kind of things he can see and manage, right? So I think once you log into Salesforce instance, you have something called as the users tab, where you can create users. Now, to create users, you will have to provide at least 4 attributes which are mandatory, and then there could be other attributes as well for which you can provide information, but those are optional, right? So these kind of observations is what I need to know, because I want my form to be in line to the current experience of the Salesforce admin. If it is drastically different than the Salesforce admin's experience right now, there will be a lot of learning that will have to do to start using Saviynt, for which most of the client doesn't have that much time. So what my point was that firstly, you will also need to understand that, okay, when the Salesforce admin logs in, or what the Salesforce admin does in usually in his job, day-to-day job, is that he or she can create users, he or she can create licenses, he or she can create group, can assign these users to group, and let's say manage profiles. Now, these are the 5 key operations that I see that the client can do today, right? So once I know that, okay, these 5 operations is what I would like to achieve through Saviynt as well, then I can proceed with my further analysis on whether I can do these through APIs or not. So basically, once you have the first workshop with the client, right? Let's say, so if you want to onboard a Salesforce application, the client will set up a call with their Salesforce team. Okay. And then you can ask them that what are the day-to-day operations that you do within Salesforce, and what type of objects do you manage? Do you manage users? Do you manage groups? Do you manage profiles? And if so, how do you do it, right? So they might give you a full walkthrough of their application on what they do on day-to-day basis. So that's how you'll understand that these are the objects that you would like to manage through Saviynt as well. So that is one part of it, right? That you would like to understand what are the key capabilities within the target application, and then start thinking about how to manage it through Saviynt. Now, a disclaimer here is that most of the objects that you can manage through Saviynt has already been listed as part of their documentation. So if you go to Salesforce connector documentation, you'll get to know they have already listed out all the objects that you can actually manage through the Salesforce connector. So is the case with all the out of the box connector. If you go to their connector documentation, they will tell you that, okay, we can manage through our connector. You can manage users, groups, profiles, licenses, whatever it is, right? And there will be some connectors where they'll say that, okay, we can manage these four objects, but we cannot manage the fifth one because of our implementation restrictions, right? So that is a kind of information that you might receive upfront, but there is a catch to it, right? The catch is that when so Saviynt might say that, okay, we manage all the objects, but they may or may not, okay, because see the Saviynt is a comparatively a new tool, so there are exceptions where they'll say that they do manage objects, but it might not work for your implementation, okay, or they might have bugs because of which you cannot productionize it, right? So you'll have to do your own analysis. Just seeing the documentation don't tell to the client that you can manage that or you cannot manage that. It's better to see what does it support. Try to do this kind of implementation within a dev environment and test if you're able to achieve that functionality or not, right? Or a better way of committing it is that you tell the client that we can see that as part of the connected documentation, this functionality is present, but we'll have to test it first before we can commit if this can be productionized, right? So that way you are just, I mean, saving yourself as well, so that you are not doing any false commitments. Anyways, you're not to be blamed in case you find a bug, but the point is to set correct expectations, right? So that's what the idea of doing it is. Okay. So the first step of doing application onboarding is to understand what are the IDM capabilities that the application has. What can we do? So the example that I was giving you was of Salesforce, but there are also some other applications where you can only do user management. You can only do group management, right? So you'll have to see, having a conversation with the application owners, that what kind of IDM capabilities does their application support. Now, Salesforce, Yammer, Microsoft Exchange are very common applications. So you will find documentation at both ends, at Saviynt and the let's say and the application's own documentation as well. But if you look at other applications, let's say some custom applications or legacy applications, you might not find that information very handy. Okay, specifically in terms of legacy application, or I mean, for both rather these type of applications, the documentation is completely dependent on the application team because they are the ones who have developed this application in case of custom application. And in case of legacy application, you are also again dependent on the application owner because you do not have anywhere to go and search for this documentation, right? That what are the IDM capabilities. So you have to ask the application owners what type of IDM capabilities do your application have, and whether what kind of connections parameters can we use. So again, a good way of doing it is to list down all the capabilities that you have seen being used by Saviynt. So what do I mean by that is when I say that I want to connect to a target application, I have a lot of options. One of the option is that I'll use the AD connector. Then I might use the LDAP connector. I might use REST connector, right? I might use SOAP connector. So all these type of connections is what Saviynt already supports. So I can simply ask the application owners, does your application supports any kind of any of these kind of connections, right? Can we connect to your app using your app's Active Directory or your app's LDAP store or REST or SCIM APIs, right? So these are the type of things that you'll have to have a conversation with the application owners about. But the whole point is that once you understand how their application works, you also need to visualize how you can connect to that application using Saviynt. Because again, being the Saviynt experts, you need to know what kind of connections can you establish from Saviynt to the target application, and then you propose it to them. Okay, that these are the things that we feel can be introduced here. Would you like the same things to be? I mean, would you like the same things to be used for integration purpose? Now, why do I say so? Why can't we just go ahead and choose it by ourselves, right? That we'll use this technology to connect to the target application. The reason behind that is that let's say the target application might have an LDAP store, right, or a separate, let's say, an Oracle database. okay, that it is using right now. It is not necessary that they would like you to connect to their Oracle database, because that's an active database which their application is using today. And if you do a read or write operation, right, which disrupts their database, they cannot afford that. So even though you see that they have an Oracle DB, let's say that they are using, and you have an Oracle database connector as well, even in that case, you cannot just start integrating with it. You need to go through the formal route of understanding if they have any dependencies on this Oracle DB, or let's say even better would be if in case they have any dev environment, even at the target application end that they can use to connect. Okay, that way, even if you, do something wrong during your testing, you do not actually, let's say, disrupt any of their services. Okay, so that's the second point. So again, I'll go back to the presentation and let's talk about this. So firstly, what we have mentioned is that we need to do application analysis, which is to understand the IAM capabilities of the application, right? So we'll have an initial notification and application integration document. This is again an optional thing. If you want to create a document, you can do that. In case you don't want to do it, you can avoid that. You set up a meeting with the application owners, you do the requirement gathering, you convert your business requirements into technical requirements, and then you request access to these applications. So I think this is nothing new for us. We've been discussing this for a long time, that whenever you want to connect to these applications, you'll need certain credentials. We've been talking about OAuth 2.0, OIDC, SAML, right? All these different authentication protocols. So if even if you're using something else, let's say if you want to connect using the LDAP Connect, right? Or if you want to establish a connection with Active Directory, even for these kind of applications, you need the host name, port name, username, password, and only then you can connect to these applications. Hence, this information needs to come from the application managers or application team. You cannot just go inside the application and collect this information. So it is always good to request access at the initial level itself, right? Because it saves time. So by the time things gets moving, you already will have access to these applications, and you can start onboarding the application. The second step that we usually do is API analysis. Okay. So API analysis is also something that we've been talking about continuously, right? And we've talked about rigorously. So what do we mean by API analysis is, and again, I think we have talked about APIs themselves, but not from a comparison standpoint, or how do you do this comparison? So basically, what you do is there are multiple applications which will not support only one, let's say, API, but maybe all the three APIs that we've talked about till now, right? So there could be an application which supports REST API, which supports SCIM API, and which supports SOAP API. So now it's a difficult choice to make. How would you compare that for this particular integration, which API should I use? So basically, the bare minimum is to understand whichever API basically solves your solves your requirement. Okay, so let's say if the REST API is able to support, if you want to do user management only, and the REST API supports user management along with entitlement and group management. So and if that is the same case with SCIM, you can use either of them, right? So the first thing is, if the client has told you that we want to do user management, then you need to know whether through REST API, whether can I do user management or not, right? So similarly, you need to evaluate the other two APIs as well. So let's say if the REST API is the only API which supports user management within Salesforce, then the answer is clear that you'll go ahead with REST API. The problem arises, or the complication arises, when all the three APIs uh, can provide you the same functionality. So if the user management can be done through REST API as well as SOAP API as well as SCIM API, then it becomes a question which one to use, right? But the bare minimum, the first question is that if you want to do user management, through which API you can do user management. Okay. So in Salesforce, you can do it through all the three. But in other applications, there could be a restriction. What happens is, as I was telling you, there are separate development teams which exposes these APIs from the application team. Okay. So Salesforce develop these APIs themselves. Okay. And they put this documentation on their website where they tell you that, okay, these are all the functionalities that we support as part of this API. And that is what you can refer to. But in case of custom application or legacy application, you need to do this evaluation either yourself or ask the application team whether this API supports user management or not. If it does, then what are the endpoints that we need to do API calls on? what are the operations that we need to do. So yesterday, if you remember, we were discussing about post call. We did a get operation as well as, let's say, generating an access token. So you need to understand how their API functions. Okay. So the first step is to understand which of this API caters to your bare minimum requirements. If all of all the three does it, then you'll have to do a comparison between the pros and cons of all these three. Okay, so what are the pros and cons? So see, REST API, usually because it has been around for a longer duration time, the usual way is that REST actually supports the most functionalities. Okay. So when I say that REST supports most functionalities, I mean that whatever other APIs can do, ideally would be a subset of what REST can do. Reason being, it has existed for a longer duration of time, and it is more mature as a technology. Okay. If you talk about Skim, there is a good chance that the client would like to go with Skim APIs as the means of integration over REST, because it is the standard now. Okay. And so it is standard for IAM integrations. And is seen as technology of future. Okay. So by technology of future, I do not mean any, let's say, very new or innovative technology. The only point is that Skim is nothing but it is a modern implementation of REST API. Okay. It is just that it has been optimized more from an identity management point of view. And that is why there are many organizations and people who will choose Skim APIs over REST APIs. So let's say for Salesforce, if I tell the client that both the Skim and REST API supports the same functionality, and hence we can go ahead with any of them, they will rather ask us to go with Skim, right? Because that is the standard. It is more optimized for identity management because it exposes the entire schema of let's say of all the objects, identity management objects that you have on the target application. There are very few limited use cases where a SOAP connection would be used in case you already have a REST or Skim API, right? But again, that could be very specific to business requirements. So let's say if there is a report that you want to generate out of Salesforce, and that report contains an object which is not covered by REST or Skim APIs. In that particular use case, you might need to do an SOAP-based integration. Otherwise, you won't, right? So SOAP is basically and mostly used when you don't have REST or Skim APIs available. Okay, so only that is when you use the SOAP API. Now, even if I've decided that REST and Skim both are supporting the same functionality, is it mandatory that the client will go ahead with the Skim API, or is it mandatory that we as implementation specialists should be going ahead with Skim API based integration? The answer is no. Okay, because Skim is relatively new, there are certain objects which could not be managed through Skim. So I'm not talking in generic term. So I mean, ideal case scenario, whatever objects you can manage through REST API, you should be able to manage it through Skim as well. But in cases, I've seen that so the user management part could be done by both REST and Skim, but there are, let's say, a group or a role that you would not be able to manage through Skim because it has not been implemented yet. Okay, so that is why whenever you start doing application onboarding, you need to do a good level of evaluation, okay, over what APIs to use, and because ultimately, let's say just seeing at the documentation, if you start onboarding application, in between you might realize that okay, we wanted to manage this as well, this object as well, but we are not able to because the API doesn't support. So that is the second point, that you do API analysis. You analyze connectivity operations between REST, Skim, and SOAP. What kind of connectivity does the target application support? You compare the type of authentication and authorization mechanisms as well. See, and this is also a key consideration that whenever you are doing these kind of integrations, you'll also have to understand that what are the authentication and authorization protocols will you have to use for this integration. Why do I say so? Because many clients will have a clear-cut security policy which states that only OAuth can be used as an authentication mechanism for any integration. Okay. it cannot be basic. Okay, so it should not be basic. Or let's say it can only be OIDC. Okay, so if they have already defined that part of their security policy, you'll have to make sure that you are following their standards, right? So that is something that you need to understand, that what kind of authentication protocol does the target application support, and again, take a call whether your client allows that kind of authentication mechanism or not. And this is a key consideration because this is not only about identity and access management, but these type of decisions on what, let's say, authentication protocols are allowed and which are not are an, let's say, decision which is taken across the cybersecurity of a company. It is not only for identity and access management, for data protection and privacy and all other kind of, let's say, cybersecurity domains. It must be defined across the scope. So that is why you need to keep it in mind. So that is basically the second step that you'll see, that the first is application analysis, the second is API analysis, and the third one is dev integration. So let's say once you have, and again, I'm sorry, I missed the third point. That's really important. That whenever you are doing this API analysis, and once you are done with your own analysis, you need to do Postman analysis as well. Okay, so what do I mean by Postman analysis? Okay, so when I talk about API analysis, obviously I gave you guys yesterday an example of how we do different kind of API calls, right? And what do we use it for? But when you go for an end-to-end analysis, what you need to understand is that you need to manage core objects. So if you see, I'm taking an example of the Box as a target application. So Box is a implementation of REST API. They call it as content API. So there is nothing different. It is REST API only, but they've given their own branding. So all these companies does the same thing, right? So the underlying technology is REST, but they start calling it, they give it their own name because it is their own implementation of REST API. And this is what I was telling you guys yesterday as well, that there will be a slight change between two applications implementations of REST API. Okay, because the objects that you would like to that these APIs manage are different because the work that these applications do are different. Okay. So, anyways, so what I'm trying to tell you is that you need to go and understand that what are the APIs that the application exposes. And once you understand that, you would like to make these calls through Postman and see how is the request and the response payload looks like. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Yesterday we had a look on how we generate access token and refresh token, right? So that comes as part of authentication, which is basically OAuth 2.0, right? So how do we request authorization? This is the endpoint that I will have to use, and for this I'll have to provide my client ID. How do I get the access token, the refresh token? Which call do I need to make? What are the parameters that I need to pass? We were discussing over and over again: client type code, client ID, client secret, right? How do I get a access token from a refresh token? This is how I do it, right? So I have to provide the refresh token value here, the client ID and client secret, and then I'll get the access token. And in case I want to destroy a token, you can do that. So if you remember yesterday, I told you that so if you don't want to use the client ID and client secret and don't want to share it over the internet over and over again, we use the refresh token. But if you see in Box APIs, they have kept client ID and client secret as required as well, right? So this is what I meant when I said that every target application has their own implementation of APIs, right? So this might not be true for other applications, but the Box APIs have been implemented like this, that you'll have to pass this information as well. So that is the reason I'm telling you that you need to do API analysis, because you cannot go by the assumption that all the APIs would be the same, right? Because it is REST API, it will function a certain way. That is not the case. There will be slight tweaks here and there, which you will have to take into consideration that once you start onboarding application from Saviynt end as well, right? So when you go to the Saviynt connector and choose Box, you might have to provide all this information to in your connection, and then you will also have to provide that create account JSON, import account JSON, and how that JSON will look like. How would you understand? How would you get to know that, right? So for that, you'll have to go to user and then do a create an enterprise user. And once you go here within body, you'll see that okay, these are two mandatory attributes that are there. One is login and the second is name. So basically now you can also add in other attributes as well, but at least you know how how it should be passed, how the value should be passed. Yeah, right. So if in case you want to add more information to it, you can go to and check at the box API documentation on what other attributes does the API support, then paste it here and check if it functions, right? So then you can do a, let's say, post call, which is about creating a user and send it. Once you send it, in the response, you'll get 200 OK, and the user would be created. Then you'll get to know that, okay, these attributes we can manage through box REST API. So is the case for other functionalities as well. In case you want to, let's say, reset a user's password, what is the API that I need to hit? So see, here we've said that we have api.box.com/2.0, which is again the same thing that we've been discussing from day one. But then we have also provided the user's unique ID. Okay, so this is the user's primary key. So that's how I'm telling the target application that I want to reset the password for a user, but for which user? This user, right? And I'll pass the password in the body. So in the body, I've mentioned is password reset required? The answer is true. So I'm saying that whenever for the first time, whenever the user logs in now, they'll have to reset their password, and only then they'll be able to log in. Similarly, you'll have to, if you want to update a user's information, you have the same endpoint, and you so this key that you see here is the unique identifier of the user. Okay, and that is why you see it here. So what I'm telling the target application is that please allow me to go to the user's object, and within user's object, you have a user with this user ID for which I want to update the status from active to inactive. And then I'll do a post. Okay. So these kind of information is something that you'll definitely need once you start onboarding applications, because if you do not understand this, you keep on passing information, or you keep on doing hit and trial with the Saviynt instance, you'll never exactly get to know where you are going wrong, right? So it is always good to do these kind of API analysis before starting your integration at the Saviynt level. Okay. So I've given you some examples about the users object. I also would like to give you some from other objects. So let's say group. Okay. So within group, I have an option called as get all group. So if I want to get all the group information, I can just mention group membership. So ideally, how APIs look like is if I do a get call on the group endpoint, I will get all the groups which are present on the target application. Okay. If I want to get only a specific group from all the groups, I want to only get a specific one that I need to pass on a unique ID of that group. And then it will return me all the information related to that particular group. Okay. So it's the case even in case I want to get a group membership. So if I want to know who all members or who are all the users who are part of this group, in that case, I can do a get call on the membership endpoint. So if I do it on the membership endpoint, I'll get to know, and I've already provided the group ID, primary key, right? So that is the unique identifier of the group that I'm dealing with. And I want to get all the users who is member of this group. I'll do a get call on this particular endpoint. And hence all those will be listed down. Similarly, so if you see here, you have something called as enterprise group, and then you have something called as normal group. So this is also a type of understanding that you need to take, that what is the difference between a normal group and an enterprise group, and which is the one that the client wants me to manage through Saviynt, or whether they want to manage both through Saviynt, and in case they want to manage only one, how do I manage that through the API, right? That is also kind of understanding that you will need once you do the API analysis. And the API analysis is a key consideration, okay, for the integration, because from Saviynt, whenever you want to do anything on the target application, API is the middle layer which will facilitate you to do that. In case that is not configured properly, the request won't be sent out to the target application in the current context, in the correct way, and that is something that the target application won't be able to process, and ultimately your operations will fail. So that is something that you need to keep in mind. I understand it is slightly a theoretical topic as such, but it is really important for you to understand for integration standpoint. Now, let's say if I want to add a user to a group, okay, how do I do that? So I'm saying that within my host name, I have an object called as group membership. So if I do a post operation on group membership and I explain which group do I want the user to get assigned to, right? The user will get assigned to that group. Okay. So this is what is called as a JSON payload. Okay. This is called as a JSON payload. And the type of analysis that I'm talking about is called as payload analysis. Okay. So this is an analysis that you need to do. Why? Because the target application will only understand the what you are trying to achieve if you pass on the values in this format. If you're not passing it in this format, you won't be able to perform this operation. And hence you need to understand how this information needs to be passed. So see here, if you can see, you have a group object. Within group, you have defined the key, the unique identifier of this particular group, which is ID attribute. And you also have to explain what type of object you are dealing with, which is group, and then the user and the unique identifier, which is ID, and the value of ID. This is how you pass on this information. For, there will be many applications for which you have out of the box connector, for which you may not even need to go in this detail of doing the analysis, because the objects that you want to manage are fairly simple, and those are managed as part of the usual payload itself. Because even if you go so even if we go here and I want to manage, let's say, the Salesforce connector. So if you see here, for the Salesforce connector, you have all the details listed down here, right? And then you can see that they have mentioned whether they support creating, update, enabling, disabling, or freezing of accounts or not, right? So these are the lifecycle management operations, and add or remove access, whichever one is supported by their connector or not. In case there are certain operations which are not supported, you can see they've added it in the notes. That Salesforce does not support remove account operation. The remove account operation from EIC disables the user in Salesforce. Extremely important to understand. So you understand that on the target application, even the user can be stated or can be bifurcated into two parts. One is the user identity and the second is the user account. So the way Salesforce's own APIs has been implemented, and I'm telling you this from my past experience, that the way APIs have been implemented for Salesforce, if you there are certain loopholes in that, right? So to be frank, they've mentioned it within the notes that Salesforce does not support remove account operation. The remove account operation EIC disables user in Salesforce. It could be that the APIs have been implemented in a way where it doesn't provide us an API actually to disable a user. Okay. So that is again something that you need to study upfront before you can before you can commit to the client that okay, we can do that and we cannot do that. Then you have something called as profiles. So whether it can be supported, whether if it is supported, yes, it is supported, and you can configure attribute mapping for profile import during import. Now this attribute mapping is exactly what I was referring to. Okay, that which information needs to be passed. See, can you see here? They themselves have taken a Postman request, um, like a screenshot, because everyone who is doing IDM implementations or who want to analyze the APIs will use Postman to analyze those, because it's a very small utility and a very simple utility. Okay, we've already talked about all these things: connected app, client ID, client secret. So I won't touch upon that again. What I'm more, let's say, yeah. So default attribute mapping. So this is what I was more inclined towards, that you need to know that which attribute within Saviynt is mapped to which attribute within Salesforce. So the name attribute will be mapped against name, display name will be mapped against display name, and so on and so forth. But whether they have you see. So if you see here, there is a sample JSON account field mapping that they have provided here. So where will they get this mapping from? To get this mapping, to understand that what is the how is the last name let's say defined within the Salesforce instance. you'll have to do Postman analysis. Only then you'll get to know that how do you need to pass this value. So all the Saviynt attributes are going to remain the same. The account ID is called as account ID, display name is display name, and then you might have status, and then you might have account type, right? But which attribute needs to be mapped with account type, and how do you how actually do you need to define this, right? So the user type could be small u and then a space between user and type, right? It could be that as well. But you know that it has to be passed in a certain way. And how do you know it? Because you've done your own API analysis, and from the Postman you can see that this particular attribute needs to be passed in like that, and also what is the data type of this particular attribute. Okay, so we mentioned most of the attributes as character. So I hope you understand what we are trying to achieve, right? So what I'm saying is that within connection, you'll have account, let's say import account JSON, you'll have create account JSON. But where does that JSON come from, right? So usually the left-hand side, which is the Saviynt attributes are present within Saviynt and in their documentation, so you'll know about it. On the right-hand side, these attributes are mostly declared, or let's say this information could be found on the documentation front, but it is always better to do an analysis at the Postman level as well to make sure that the mapping is correct, okay, and the formatting is correct. And the way, see, if you see even here, the example that they've given, the curly braces and the big brackets, all the brackets that they've used are in a very specific manner. Why is that? Why do we need to follow the structure? Because the target application only understands this structure. And that is why it is important to do your own Postman analysis to understand how the information needs to be passed, right? So that is the reason for emphasizing so much on API analysis, because only then you'll be able to provide proper details within connections. It could be a bit too much, I understand, for you guys to take to, but to be frank, I'm not telling you something new. I'm just covering different objects, right, to give you an idea on how things are managed. So basically, if I just want to conclude whatever we have discussed till now, you have the capability of defining a user, you have the capability of defining groups or entitlements, and then you also have the capabilities of associating it the users with groups, right? And that is how all of this functions at the back end. So that is, if you want to do this kind of analysis, it is good. If you don't want to do it and you want to rely on trial and error from the Saviynt instance itself, you can do that as well. But I assume that it is more time consuming. Okay. So the way we have talked about adding a user, adding a group, adding a user to a group, right? Now we can also talk about different type of groups. So the groups, an enterprise group, and then you have separate operations that you can perform on enterprise group and normal group. So that is also is worth having a look at, because it has happened to me and to many developers. It happened in the past. If you have not done this API analysis upfront, it has happened with me that during the UAT of our implementation, we got to know that the type of user that we are creating through our integration is a normal user, whereas the client wants the user to be an employee, and employee and user were two different objects on the application that I was dealing with. Okay. So after 4 months of effort, we had to again go back to the drawing board and again start the development from the scratch. Okay. So obviously we did use some of the things that could be reused for this implementation, but that is the kind of, let's say, problem we might face in case we do not do the study well enough um, earlier. Okay. You would not like that surprise to come in later during the implementation. So, okay, doing this Postman analysis is fairly important. I think I've emphasized on this enough. Okay. But what I'll do is I'll quickly give you some more examples. So see, whatever we've discussed till now has been mostly from a user perspective, like user management perspective, creating users, updating users, deleting users, assigning users to a group and stuff. But you also do have capabilities of managing groups, creating groups, updating groups, right? That kind of information, that kind of operations can also be there. And for that you'll have separate APIs. So you don't just want to restrict yourself to the user's API, but you might want to have a look at the group API and what you can do from here. And similarly, within within box, you also have something called as folders. So folders access is what you define, right, to different users. So you might think that you might get confused. that whether folders should be part of identity and access management or not, right? So the answer is it could be. Okay. It completely depends on what the client wants you to manage. If they want you to manage the user's access to a certain folder, you can manage it through Saviynt as well. Because what you will do is you will keep on doing the normal user management, but you will add attributes related to folders and you will store that information and you will explore that option as well. Okay, so I'm not really sure if the box connector for Saviynt offers that capability or not, but from an API perspective, that is supported. Okay, so that's what that is again a key consideration to have. That whenever you are doing entitlement management, also try to understand that what kind of APIs are you looking forward to. Is it just sorry, what kind of entitlement management you are doing? So anything which decides what access do you get within an application is called as entitlement. So there is, it is not like that only groups can be considered as entitlement or only folders can be considered as entitlement. In our case, all of them can be considered as entitlement. Why so? Because if you see what access do you get after, let's say, you are present within a folder is what is being governed by this API. So that is why this can also be termed as entitlement. Okay. Files can also be termed as entitlement. So it is very dependent on the application that we are dealing with, that what are the type of entitlements that it supports. So what I'll do is now I'll move to the third part of application onboarding. So we've done, let's say, our analysis of what the target application can do. We have done an analysis on what our APIs can do. Now we'll start doing the development and integration. Okay, or let's say as we call it, dev integration. So again, once you have the entire clarity on what objects are you supposed to manage and what are the API payloads that you need to pass on to the target application, you can start developing the actual integration. Okay. So again, just to mention that once you are done with the API analysis, right, you can also share your findings with your client. Okay. And why does that help is because later on if the client, so usually this is the case when you tell the client that you're able to do the integration, that they'll be happy, right, that you are able to do so. But when once they start having a look at the loopholes, right, so and again the loopholes won't come into the picture because you have done something wrong. It is just about the way the APIs have been let's say developed. So you need to. It is always better to do an entire documentation on whatever your findings are. That let's say these are the APIs that are supported by the application. These are the objects that are supported, and these are the attributes within those objects that are supported. Okay, and we can perform these operations, and these are the payloads that needs to be used to do this integration. Because how that helps you is tomorrow if the client tells you that why are we not managing this particular entitlement a certain way, you can tell them that firstly this is how the API has been implemented. So the API has been implemented by the application team, and hence you have no you can only consume those APIs. You are not creating those APIs. Okay, so that is why this kind of documentation and getting a sign off from the client saves you from doing any kind of rework. Okay, and that is why it is always better to do that analysis, put it into a documentation, and get a sign off over that. Once that is done, you do the development integration. So again, you do the core, let's say, artifact creation. You create the connection, endpoint, and security system. Again, you do your save and test connection. You do check all the user CRUD operations. So what are the CRUD operations? Creating, reading, updating, and deleting. So you check if you are able to do that, and if you're able to do that for entitlements as well, in case that is the requirement. There are many applications for which the entitlement management will be done from the target end. Okay, and you won't be doing it. So why will that happen? So it happens that multiple times the application team would not like to manage entitlements to Saviynt, and they would like to manage it from their own application because they understand entitlements better, and because there are certain changes which are coming into the system, and that is why they would like to continue managing entitlements through their own application, whereas they would like the user management to be taken care through Saviynt. Okay, so there could be circumstances like those as well. Then what you do is you configure and test workflows. So we have covered workflows, right? So you have the capability of defining whom the request goes through for approval, and if they approve, what happens. So you have the generic manager approval workflow. There could be a two-level workflow as well, and there could be conditional workflow as well, where if certain conditions are met, then the request goes to someone. If they're not met, then it goes to someone else for approval, right? So you do that. Then you have advanced artifacts. So see, the initial three steps that I told you about, rather the initial four steps, forms the core capability when you are doing integration. The later are basically advanced features. Okay. So SODs, analytics, segregation of duties, all these features are something. So if you talk whether an integration can be done without creating a security system endpoint or connection, it is not possible. But whether it is possible to do an integration without SODs, analytics, certifications, the answer is true, right? So that is why they're termed as advanced configurations, because they are an additional feature. Okay, even if you don't implement it, the applications can still be considered to be onboarded, right? But obviously, there are clients who will force that, okay, we need this functionality along with this application. One more thing to understand is that whenever you are implementing these kind of functionalities, it is always better to tell the client that for all the applications that we're onboarding, we will be doing, let's say, three custom analytics reports or three attestations or two certifications, right? So it is always good to put a baseline number to it. If you don't do it, the problem is that, let's say, you are supposed to complete an integration within 3 months, and you have actually completed the user management operations and group management operations within 2 months. But if there is no clear number defined on how many analytics reports that you would support or provide the clients with, the requirements might keep on increasing, and that will subsequently affect your integration plan. So it is always good to put a number to it, that okay, out of the box we'll be providing these many analytics or segregation of duties. If you want more, we will need additional time, right? So do remember that. And then the next step would be to migrate it to prod. Now, prod migration is fairly simple. There are two ways you can do it. One is that you create all the artifacts again through Saviynt, okay, and that is how you usually do it. Or you have the export facility which is present within Saviynt, which is fairly simple. It doesn't need any separate introduction. It's a very simple, let's say, option that you have within Saviynt. When you click on export, you select all the artifacts that you want to export, and then you click on import in your new environment, and just import, choose the XML file, and all the artifacts will get created. So it is fairly simple. But usually people create all these artifacts again in the production environment. And then you have the SIT, UAT, and production migration, followed by hypercare. So basically, system integration testing is what you do. So let's say you have 40 applications onboarded, and now you're onboarding the 41st application. You would also like to make sure that whatever new configurations you have made are not affecting the existing one. And that is for what you need SIT for. So you do system integration testing to make sure that once you are onboarding this new application, it is working as expected and nothing else is also getting affected because of it. Whereas once the implementation is completed, you move towards UAT. So you do a basic round of testing, after which you test it from an end user's perspective. So whether the end user is able to do all the operations that he or she is supposed to do, that is called as user acceptance testing. There is also another kind of testing called as smoke testing. So once you have migrated this, so SIT basically can take rather both of them, SIT and UAT usually takes place in your test environment, not in dev environment. Okay, so dev environment is where you develop the integration. Test environment is where ideally it should get tested both for SIT and UAT, and then you do something called as smoke testing once this once this integration is migrated to the production environment. Okay, so before making it available to the entire audience or all the end users, you make this connection available only for a restricted audience, only for 2 or 3 people, okay, who are from the application team, and they test it, all right, all the functionalities, whether they're functioning fine or not, and then it is made available to all the people who will be using it, all the end users, okay, and that is called the smoke testing. So once all these three type of testing is done, only then actually the whole production go live happens. Okay. Now, what do we mean by production migration is what you already know, that we would like to migrate it from a lower environment to a to a higher environment, and then you do hypercare. Hypercare basically is about managing and keep on checking with the new integration that you have done and look for any anomalies that you might find out. So for 7 days, ideally, is what the normal duration is in case you want to do hypercare, right? For new integrations to make sure that your integration is working fine and also to make sure it is not affecting any other applications or integrations in any manner. Okay. So that is what SIT, UAT, production migration and hypercare is all about. So basically, there is another approach which is called as design, test, and build. Okay, so that is basically rather design, build, and test. Okay, so that is a circle that you follow. Okay, you design an application, you build it, you test it, and again you keep on doing the same thing till the time you've onboarded all the applications. Okay. So that is a usual approach. And again, I've drilled it down to a lot detailed in a lot detailed manner. But in case you want to, if you don't want to go in that direction, what you can do is you can skip the API analysis part if you feel that this documentation which is present at the application's endpoint and the connected documentation within Saviynt is enough for you to do the implementation. Then you can skip the API analysis and do the first, third, and fourth step. Okay, but that again, that fall is on you. So we have three environments: dev, test, and prod. In dev, you will develop it, then you'll migrate it to test environment, and there you will do SIT and UAT. And once both SIT and UAT is done, then you migrate it to production environment, do a smoke testing with the actual users there, and then make it available for everyone. And so usually for Active Directory or for some applications, you only need to make a very small change. So if the status attribute that you're passing on, the value if you're passing at one to disable an identity, you might need to just change the status code. And it will, rather than disabling, if you disable a user from Saviynt, it will get deleted on the target application. Okay. So the status attribute that you have within Saviynt, what value are you passing on in that attribute decides what will happen to the user once you disable it from Saviynt, whether it will get disabled on the target application or whether the user will get deleted on the target application. Okay, depends on the on what value you are passing.